And with that, I believe we are set. So, hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in and who happens to be listening. And it's nice to have you here with me. If you don't know me, I'm Tad Williams. I write books and stuff. Who have we got here today? Kenneth. And hi, Kenneth. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Jerry. Hi, Harmony. Hello, Alexis. And hello, Stuart. And Jeremy. And Angie. Hello, hello. And Nancy. Yes, you did guess right. I'm afraid I obfuscated. I obfuscated. Hello, Emily. And Barban. Hello, good evening. So anyway, good to see you. For those of you who have better things to do at 2 o'clock in the morning Pacific Standard Time, than getting up to listen to me blather. I started a new book last night. It was this one, The War of the Flowers. Whoops. Here, you don't need to see the name. You need to see the picture and the title. And that's what I'm reading, and that's what I'm going to start reading in a few minutes. Halstead. Hello. Anastasia. Hello. Welcome aboard. And Scott. And Scott or Heather. I don't know which one it is, so I think it might be Heather. And hello, 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 Kelly. So anyway, long story short, well, long-ish story short, everything pretty much the same here, except obviously we just went through an election, which has been a very stressful time, but things are a little better now, although some people don't seem to believe the election is over. But what can you do? There's always conspiracy theories. That's what conspiracy theories are. It's people's way of making sense and finding people to blame for things that happen that they don't like. And sometimes they're true, very, very rarely, but sometimes they are true. But unfortunately, most of them are, or fortunately, most of them are not. And the idea that there's been massive vote fudging and blah, blah, blah in this election is silly, basically. And especially some 6-7 million votes, supposedly, just, would have to be just casually manipulated. But anyway, as I said in my other production, oh, and hello, Pierre, and hello, Michael. Michael James Tanner has just commented that is a very fat cat. Yes, Lily is. Actually, Lily has lost some weight over the last year, 6 months to a year, because we've been trying to reduce her a little bit, because she is, in fact, a rather, let us say, saftig. She is ein saftig Katze. Or eine saftig Katze. I can't remember. My German is so bad now. Not that it was ever good in the first place. Hello, Alan. And so I'm not, as everybody knows me, and Ron, there's Ron. Oh, I didn't see Ron. Hello, Ron. And good job, Arizona. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the election because, as I said last night, if you really want to go on the internet and share opinions with people about the 2020 election in America, there's plenty of places. So although everybody who knows me knows that I am very pleased and very relieved, at least at this point, that's really all that needs to be said. And same thing with the family. And we are all doing pretty well under the circumstances. We're all still locked down, grumpy and difficult. And hi, Sally. Just difficult and all the pandemic stuff that almost all of you are just as familiar with as I am. But everybody is doing okay. My dad is returning slowly to health. He's probably going to be in rehab until Thanksgiving, I think he said, was the last he'd heard from his doctors. And he actually had to ask me what day it was because, I guess he was out of reach of anything where he could look up what day Thanksgiving was. So, that's the short version of what's going on around here, which is nothing much to report. Animals and cats, okay. We did just have a massive panic attack with our big dog, who is prone to them because today it rained and the wind blew really hard, and those combination of those two things are just enough to put him in freak outville all day. And so he's finally calmed down now that the weather has calmed and all that stuff, and he's kind of cooled out a little bit. But it's tough because he's big and he jumps up onto you and he wants to let you know that some terrible thing is happening outside, and he does it by taking his gigantic paws and whacking you on the head with them until you either wrestle him down onto the bed or something, or you grab his paws with both hands. And either way, it's it's hell on trying to get anything else done. But other than Johnny's bad day, the rest of us are fine, and I am happy to be here with you guys, and that seems to be enough for me. Yeah. Oh, Angie, we have a thunder coat for him and everything. His thunder coat went on. He's a lovely dog, but either he was something traumatized him when he was young, or I don't know. We're still not quite sure because he's a rescue, so we don't know his entire history. But he could also just be a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Just a very sensitive dog. Some dogs just get freaked real easily, and he's always been that way. Anywho, sorry, I'm a little, the weekends are a bit tough for me in terms of my brain, which is a fizzy, motile thing at the best of times, but with the weirdness of sleep patterns during the weekend, and especially after last week of bad sleep because of, basically not just the election, but a bunch of other stuff going on. Because of all these things, the brain is just fuzz. So bear with me if I misspeak a few times. It's honestly not senility. It's just fatigue. So we started reading the War of the Flowers last night, or this morning, I guess, very, very early. And for those of you who have not read it before and haven't had a chance to see or hear that bit, what we read was the prologue, which is about a meeting in an unspecified place, but it's fairyland. An unspecified place between the master of the House of Hellebore, and a hellebore is a kind of flower also known as a Christmas rose, and it talks a little bit about that in the prologue, between the master of the House of Hellebore and a character known as the Remover of Inconvenient Obstacles. And that's as much as we know about either of them at that point in the story. And then we started part one, which is called Goodnight Nobody. And in chapter one, our main character, Theo Vilmos, V-I-L-M-O-S, Theo Vilmos, was staying late with his friends, his band, the people he's playing with in a band. Most of them are not really friends, except for the drummer, Johnny. And when he gets home, he discovers that his partner, his girlfriend, has miscarried the baby. And after a very painful and sad set of circumstances, basically she breaks up with him. From the hospital bed, she says, what was I ever expecting? You're never going to settle down. Not only were you late that night, but you're always that way. You just don't. You're not grown up. Is basically what she says. And I just can't put up with it anymore. So on top of losing the baby, Theo has also just been kicked out of the house he was sharing with his girlfriend and lost his relationship. So that's where Theo is. So Theo's in San Francisco. At this point, the real world is the only setting. So until something specifies otherwise, as it will at the beginning of this next chapter, but while Theo's in the story, until he changes locations, he will be in the real world, and specifically in Northern California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. So now I am going to start, and I'm going to read chapter 2, The Silent Primrose Maiden. Half a day's drive outside the great city, far enough away to intrude only lightly on the consciences of families and friends, consciences underdeveloped by both habit and breeding in many of the leading clans, the mansion stood. It had once belonged to a scion of the upstart Zinnia house, but the fortunes of that family had fallen as swiftly as they had earlier risen, and although it still bore their name and crest above the door, the former inhabitants had sold the huge house long ago, and moved to far more modest digs in the city, a collection of family apartments near the waterfront, where they could keep a close watch on their shipping interests and dream of better days gone. And they hoped better days still to come. But Zinnia Manor remained, nestled in a fold of the forested hills of true Arden, surrounded by grounds that, although less carefully cultivated than in its happiest days, were still green and sumptuous and, most important of all, large enough to create privacy. The manor had 3 or 4 times as many inhabitants now as when the family still owned it. The administrator, Mr. Lungwort, a small, dapper fellow whose rudimentary wings had resisted all attempts at cosmetic removal, growing back several times, and thus forcing him to try to hide them with carefully padded suits. Let me try that sentence again. Mr. Lungwort, a small, dapper fellow whose rudimentary wings had resisted all attempts at cosmetic removal, growing back several times, and thus forcing him to try to hide them with carefully padded suits, claimed it was more like managing a village than a house. Beside the regular residents, there were several dozen staff, including cooks, maids, janitors, and gardeners, not to mention the nurses and orderlies. 2 alienists and a certified chirurgeon were on duty at all times, and other practitioners were kept on call for when things got busy, as they often did during full moons. In such a large facility, with an impressive catalog of patients whose conditions were vivid and even occasionally dangerous, inverted shadows, spontaneous creation, infectious hallucination, and several variants of uncontrollable shape-shifting, it was strange that the most noteworthy resident should be so quiet and inoffensive. She had her own suite of rooms on the south side of the manor, courtesy of her famous and powerful family, which, except for occasional visits from one brother, wanted nothing to do with her anymore. But she might as well have been living in a ditch beside the highway, for all the notice or advantage she took of her surroundings. Day after day, the morning sun splashed into her room, but she never raised her eyes to the windows. Day after day, attendants came and got her out of the bed where they had placed her the night before, then washed and dressed her, manipulating her slack body as though she were a corpse being readied for burial. Day after day, at least when the weather was fair, they set her in a sedan chair, not an easy task even for some of the larger, stronger creatures on the staff, for although the patient was slender, she was tall and long of limb, and always as limp as a sack, and rolled her out to the manor's garden. There she would remain, eyes staring straight out at nothing, the hands her attendants had folded still lying neatly in her lap, her handsome, fine-boned face as hollowly purposeless as a bell with no clapper, until someone came and took her away again. Once, during one of the power outages, which were occurring in the city and its outskirts with worrying frequency these days, a muddled staff had neglected to bring her in. The night nurse, seeing her empty bed, had gone looking for her and found her still sitting in her chair in the garden, staring at nothing, her dress soaked with dew and her milk-white skin goose-pimpled with cold. Mr. Lungwort had been very upset about that, not so much out of pity. It was hard for anyone with the administrator's somewhat narrow personality to pity something that showed no more liveliness than a lump of wax, but out of fear that her wealthy family might discover the mistake and remove her from Zinnia Manor along with her sizable endowment. 2 nurses were sacked, and a night orderly was severely reprimanded, but the patient herself gave no sign that her night outdoors had made any difference. Lungwort's records showed that her name was Arafine, but he did not encourage conversational familiarity between his staff and their charges, the guests, as Lungwort called them, and especially not toward members of the highest houses, however intimate the staff's interactions with them might be, however unprepossessing the patient. To her blank face, a face that animation might have made beautiful, they addressed her only as Lady Primrose, or simply my lady. The sound of their voices and the touch of their careful hands seemed to mean no more to her than had the night dew, If she had been a mortal woman and her caretakers mortal too, the word soulless might have been whispered. But fairies do not pretend to have souls, and if they do have such things, they are not aware of them. To the nurses and orderlies of Zinnia Manor, many of them unabashed wearers of wings and unrepentant believers in the old tales and ways, it was clear that their unmoving, unspeaking charge, so pretty, so utterly lifeless, must have a story, something darkly romantic and grandly tragic. But if the administrator or anyone else knew it, the secret remained closely held. When the staff drank betony tea together and gossiped about Mr. Lungwort's padded suits and the disgusting proclivities of the Feverfew twins, they called her the Silent Primrose Maiden and tried to imagine what had happened to bring her to this terrible condition. Not even the most extravagant guesses came anywhere near the truth. After all, it was possible to imagine that lives might once have been lost and reputations sacrificed for the light in her eyes, those eyes that were now so terribly, terribly empty. But none of the gossiping staff of Zinnia Manor could have guessed that soon an entire world might pass into eternal shadow for the sake of that same dead stare. Chapter 3, Descent. And that's Descent, not like dissension. Descent. It was a good day, one of the very few in the 2 months since Kat's miscarriage, since the night his old life ended, as he sometimes thought of it, never considering how he might be tempting fate. A decent night's sleep, and for once no bad dreams, gave Theo a looseness in his heart and his step he hadn't felt for a while. He had been having the same nightmare a lot lately, eerie and claustrophobic, where he was trapped in something like a room full of mist or smoke, staring out at the unreachable world through a thick window. But today, bad dreams seemed to have evaporated in the sunshine. Walking through a building lobby, carrying a combination of flowers clearly chosen over the phone by someone, but guiltily displayed in an expensive vase to make up for it, he even found himself singing an old Smokey Robinson song. A pretty young receptionist, too young to be more than a momentary fancy for him, but that made it all the more satisfying in a way, told him he had a beautiful voice. "Thanks," he said. "I'm a singer. That's my other job." She didn't inquire further, but that was all right. It was enough just to be reminded that there was more to his life than this delivery job. The band hadn't practiced for at least 3 weeks. All kinds of weirdness going on there, but for once nothing to do with him, since Chris and Morgan were having some kind of feud. He was still a singer, though. He could pick up his guitar and go stand on a street corner and earn almost as much as he did dragging potted plants up elevators to overworked secretaries and retiring data clerks. Of course, almost as much as very little equaled nearly nothing. So for the moment, he'd keep driving the van. Thank you very much. As the bit of Second That Emotion falsetto and the receptionist's smile had reminded him, there was more to him than just an aging adolescent with longish hair and a Cassigian the florist patch sewn on the breast of his shirt. But the problem was, if his old life really had ended that night, where was the new one? It was one thing to have your girlfriend throw you out. Even in such miserable circumstances, there could still be something liberating in that kind of forced change, but not when you had to move back in with your mother. It was only for a few months, of course, only until he had saved a little money for first and last on a decent apartment. He could have moved in with Johnny Battistini, who had invited him, but although he loved the man like a brother, the idea of living with him again was a bit much. Theo could never be called fastidious, as Catherine herself had often pointed out, but you didn't have to be a neat freak to be uncomfortable with 6-month-old fast food hardening to stone under the couch. He had shared an apartment with Johnny once, years before he'd met Cat, and he still hadn't shaken the memory of stepping on bugs in the dark. Besides, it wasn't like his mother forced him to talk with her or even to interact much at all. He had his own key. If he was home at dinner time, which he rarely was, she would heat him up the same leftovers she was eating or put a frozen meal in the microwave for him. If he wanted to watch a different program than she was watching, she didn't seem to mind. She would silently hand him the remote, take a book, and go to bed. She didn't make a mess. She didn't play loud music. She didn't force him to have long, boring conversations. If she had been a male roommate, she would have been damn near ideal. As a mother, though, she was a little spooky. When he had tried to explain her to Kat back when they were first dating, he had stated, a bit archly, "Mom's flame of life doesn't burn all that bright." But, faint as it was, it had burned brighter once than it did now. He was surprised at how little she seemed to care about anything these days. Was it some kind of delayed reaction to his father's death almost 6 years ago? Or was it Theo who had changed? Had living with Kat made him more used to how normal people behave? He had no idea. Anna Vilmos was a hard woman to figure out. She came to all his school plays, he remembered. Showed up every night when I had the lead in the musical. It must have meant something to her, but she never had much to say about it. Very nice, Theo, you did well. I enjoyed it. That was about all, like she was talking about a piece of corned beef she'd got from the butcher. And his father had been too tired most of the time to say anything either, except that the show or recital in question had been pretty good, all the time making it clear that what he really wanted was to get home to bed because he had to get up early the next morning. See, Kat, who can turn into a normal grown-up when his role models are polite strangers? But today, driving the delivery van, even the bleakness of living back at his mother's house could not dim his feeling that a change was coming, that a sort of dormancy was over. He had been surprised how powerfully the twin blows of losing Catherine and the baby had struck him. It was more than just weird, bad dreams. For weeks he had found himself bursting into mortified tears while listening to old songs on the van radio. Songs he had never liked that much in the first place. Anthems of lost love, 50s car accident weepies, and horrible saccharine tunes about dead girlfriends and children. Even things that seemed to have nothing to do with his own upside-down life could catch him like a sharp needle in the heart. Once an old chestnut from the 70s about a drowning sheepdog, as far as he could tell, since he had never listened to the lyrics very intently, made him pull over because he was crying too hard to see. But not today. Spring had actually arrived a month ago, but for the first time he could feel himself respond to it, as though he too were full of sap being warmed by the sun, as if he were about to bud. Don't know about budding, he thought as he pulled the van into the slot behind the store. Maybe I could go out and catch a few beers with Johnny. Go listen to some music. An Irish band he had heard about was playing at a club in the Mission. He considered inviting his mother. She was Irish by birth, after all, and she had a kind of weird soft spot for Johnny B. Soft for her, anyway. And Johnny, in turn, kind of flirted with her. He had actually once said, "Your mom must have been at least a semi-babe when she was young." The whole thing had been far too bizarre for Theo to deal with, but now he found himself liking the idea of taking her out with him and Johnny. Might do her good, and he would feel a little less guilty about sharing the house with her as though he were an itinerant stranger. "You're singing," Kasigian said as Theo hung the keys on the hook board. "Is that a good thing?" "Guess that's for the people listening to decide." Kasigian squinted at him, gnawed his pencil. He had a shiny bald head like an ancient tortoise, but the rest of him was surprisingly fit for his 60-something years. He jogged, sometimes coming into the shop on hot days in running shorts and allowing the employees to make respectful jokes about his thin brown legs. "It could be worse. You sing okay, but I don't like it when my employees are happy. I think when they're not afraid, they don't work so hard." A priceless example of your 19th century management style. Theo plucked his faithful leather jacket off the rack. "That's why you win the Ebenezer Scrooge Award year after year, Mr. K. They're going to have to retire that trophy, you know. Go home, singing boy. Go annoy someone with less to do. Kosygin could be an unalloyed bastard occasionally, and he certainly wasn't going to drown his employees in money and benefits, but he was at least middling honest and did a pretty good imitation of the gruff but lovable boss when he wanted to. Too good, really. That's how you could tell it was only an act. Theo rode back to the Sunset District with the visor of his helmet open. The wind was damp and warm, and the smell of blossoming things filled the air, stronger even than the auto exhaust. Mrs. Crayley was out in the yard next door, watering her garden. Theo waved to her. She did not wave back, although she was only using one hand to operate the hose. Mrs. Crayley was another thing that made staying at his mother's such a warm, satisfying experience. His mother did not respond to his call when he came in. After the terrible night when he had found Kat, he had a reflexive need to know where everyone was, so he checked and found her in her bedroom, napping, fully dressed, propped on 3 pillows, her chest moving up and down just like it was supposed to. It was strange to see her sleeping in the middle of the day, but then again, he seldom came home right after work ended. He wandered back to the kitchen, took a bottle of beer out of the refrigerator, then made his way out to the tidy emptiness of the living room. He found himself wishing that if he had to be stuck in his parents' house, it was at least the house in San Mateo in which he had grown up, a place with memories, where he would have something to react to, even if only depressive nostalgia. But his mother and father had bought this house less than 10 years ago, a year after Theo had moved out for good and his father had retired. A retirement Peter Vilmos had only had a few years to appreciate before the massive stroke had killed him. His picture stood by itself on the mantel, a setting too stark to be any kind of shrine. There were moments when Theo thought he saw his own features in his father's, when the jaw or cheekbones seemed inarguably his own, but most of the time the man seemed as remote genetically as he had been paternally. A decent guy who had simply worked too many hours to have much strength left for dad stuff. There were no other pictures of Pete Vilmos anywhere on display, which had more to do with Theo's mother than any fault of his father. She had only one of Theo as well, a school picture from when he was in 2nd or 3rd grade that sat on her dresser, still in its original little cardboard frame. There were no other photographs visible in the house, and very few pictures of any kind. The large framed print of a bridge over the River Liffey in Dublin on the living room wall was the exception. And Theo believed it was mostly there because the wall would look too bare without it. Anna Dowd Vilmos was not sentimental. In an uncharacteristic bit of disorganization, his mother had left her coat over one of the chairs and her purse lying on its side on the dining room table. A small scatter of objects had fallen out of the open top. He found himself wondering what exactly it was she did all day. She volunteered at the library, but that was only once a week. Most of her working years had been spent cooking and cleaning for her child and her fairly old-fashioned husband. What did she do with her time? A pang of guilt struck him, that he was only thinking about this now, with his own life in tatters. Dad had been dead for a long stretch. Had Theo, her only child, ever gone to her and asked her if there was something he could do to help? Had he tried to make time for her? Take her out? Get to know her? Sure, she wasn't the most responsive person in the world, but he hadn't done much to try to overcome that, had he? He left the silent television, the muted scenes of car accidents and school district protests on the early evening news, and hung his mother's coat up in the closet. He could make her dinner. That would be something nice to wake up to, wouldn't it? He wasn't a great cook, but he wasn't hopeless, and even grilled cheese sandwiches and canned tomato soup would be better than her having to get up and do the cooking. Or maybe he should just take her out to a proper dinner. Call John from a restaurant, then they could all go out and see that Irish band. He was halfway through scooping the fallen objects back into her purse when he realized he was holding a pill bottle, that he had been looking at it for some moments without quite understanding why he had paused. Fentanyl citrate, the label read. It also had a bright orange warning label. It took long seconds reading through the many cautionary notations on the label before he understood what he was looking at was some kind of morphine derivative. Serious, serious pain medication. His insides went cold as though he himself were being numbed. He stared at it a moment longer, then, not entirely conscious of what he was doing or why, dumped his mother's purse out onto the table. A lipstick rolled off and clicked onto the floor, but he did not bend to pick it up. The glossy pamphlet, folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were white, had a bar across the top that identified it as a publication of the California Pacific Medical Center. The words on the cover, the typeface, careful, almost respectful, read, "Pancreatic Cancer, Questions and Answers." "Why didn't you tell me?" She gave him a look that was like something he'd expect from Chris Roll, almost teenage in its sullenness. "I didn't know for sure. They're still not 100% certain until they do a biopsy, but what do you call it, the endoscope showed there was a big tumor." She shrugged. "It wasn't nice, that endoscope. I didn't want to go in for it. I hoped it was nothing." "This is bad, Mom. We have to get serious about this. This is important." For a moment, her expression seemed to lighten, but there was an abyss behind her crooked smile. "Yes, Theo. I know. Sorry. Jesus, sorry." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "What did they tell you?" What they had told her was not good. If the biopsy confirmed it was malignant, as seemed very likely, it was probably stage 3 or 4, she said. He found out the next day, when he used the computer at the library to go online, that they were usually spelled stage 3 and stage 4 as though putting the ugliness in Roman numerals made it distant somehow, less fearful, a mere historical footnote. It seemed to have gone undetected for a long time already, the doctor had told her, which was often the way with pancreatic cancer, since it was seldom noticed until the tumor began to press on the other organs, and the chances were high that it had spread into her lymphatic system, rogue cells sowing the seeds of chaos throughout her body. 6 months, she said. A year if the radiation and chemotherapy help. Jesus. He stood staring at her awful composure. Are you telling me it's incurable? She shrugged again. There are some, what do they call them? Some temporary remissions. Sometimes with the chemotherapy and all that, people survive longer. It's not usual. He couldn't understand how she could sit here talking about death, her own death, as though discussing an appliance warranty. But there's a chance, right? There's always a chance, Theo. She did not have to add what was in her voice, but probably not for me. Has this been hurting you a lot, Mom? She thought about it before answering. She was not in a hurry. He had a sudden insight into how that part must feel anyway. There was no point in hurrying anything now. For a while. At first it wasn't so bad. I thought it was just aching muscles, my back, you know. Sometimes I get that when I carry things around, move the furniture to vacuum. Another stab of guilt. No, something closer to pure misery. At the thought of his mother dragging heavy sofas around so she could vacuum a house empty but for him and herself. But what did it matter now? He wanted to laugh at the horror of it all, but even with his mother's strange, detached mood, it didn't seem like the right thing to do. But he had a feeling that she'd like it better than if he started crying. He looked around the empty house, at the clean carpets and unprepossessing furniture, at the small, dark-haired woman sitting on a chair in front of him, and tried to think of something to say. I wasn't very hungry either, she said abruptly. But I've never been someone who wanted to eat a lot. Not like your father. He always had a can of nuts next to him or something like that. She stopped as suddenly as she had begun, finished with the thought. Do you want to come out with me tonight? There's an Irish band at the Kennel Club. They're supposed to be good. Real Irish music, all acoustic instruments. She actually smiled, and because it was a real smile, for the first time he could see the pain and weariness. That would be nice, Theo. Yes, let's go out. After that, the descent began. What had happened with Kat and the baby had been so sudden that it had seemed more like a brutal mugging. One moment walking down the street thinking about what you were going to have for dinner, the next lying in the gutter wondering if you could manage to crawl to where someone would find you. Watching his mother die was like something else entirely, a sort of terrible slow motion accident that went on and seemed to have no ending. But there would be an ending, of course. They spoke a different language in the land of death, he discovered. If he had thought Kat's miscarriage was wrapped around with strange arcana, he had not even begun to glimpse the possibilities. First off, it wasn't just cancer or a tumor they were dealing with. It was adenocarcinoma. They didn't examine his mother. They performed laparoscopic staging or endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography. That last word, something you wouldn't even fit on a Scrabble board. And there seemed to be no real treatments, just mysteries of which even druid priests would be proud. Things like gemcitabine or fluorouracil, palliative bypass, or even chemical splanectomy. Sometimes the smoke would rise, the curtain part, and someone in a white coat would lean out and breathe, "Percutaneous radiologic biliary stent," before disappearing again. It was like someone had opened a hole into Theo's life, his life and his mother's. But she was daily growing more and more distant in her haze of pain deadeners. And then they had backed up a trunk full of spiky Greco-Latin terms and poured them over everything in an avalanche of meaningless but still terrifying syllables. Unresectable. That was one of the worst. Metastasized. That was the worst. He had to quit his job, of course, although Kosigian was kind enough to tell him he could have it back when he wanted it. His mother, frugal by nature, had stashed a bit away out of her husband's pension and Social Security over the years, enough to pay the tiny mortgage payments and put food on the table, especially as Anna Vilmos seldom ate anything now, no matter how much Theo begged her. He was so worried about her not eating that he even got Johnny to bring over a few buds of high-grade weed, which after a great deal of argument they convinced Theo's mother to smoke. "You're trying to turn me into a dope addict like you," she said, wearily amused, clutching John Battistini's furry arm. It would have been comical, the kind of thing Theo and Johnny would have marveled over forever. "The night we got your mom stoned," except that there was nothing funny about the circumstances, about Anna Dowd Vilmos's yellowish skin, the bruised circles under her eyes, the headscarf that she always wore now, because the chemotherapy was making her hair come out of her scalp in patches. She had just discontinued the gemcitabine, declaring in a moment of stubborn determination, "It's not going to help anything, and I'm not going to die without my hair." Marijuana didn't have the effect Theo hoped. In fact, Anna had a sort of bad trip, the kind of thing he had rarely seen, even in the most paranoid of first-time smokers. She moaned and cried and began to babble about the night they took the baby, something that made no sense to Theo unless she was talking about Kat's miscarriage. As he held her, patting her awkwardly and trying not to think about how thin she had become, whispering reassuring nothings, he wondered if something in her own family history had triggered it. It was shocking how little he knew about the events of his mother's life before she had given birth to him. Even when the worst had passed, she was too distraught to do anything more that night, and certainly had no interest in eating. He put her to bed at last. Johnny went home, full of apologies, promising that he would find some mellower weed so they could try another time, but Theo knew, as he looked down at his mother whimpering in her shallow sleep, that this would be the last experiment. It was hard to say whether her remoteness in the last weeks had been denial or courage, but whatever it was, he didn't want to take it away from her again. "I want you to sell the house," she told him one morning. A morning like every other morning of late, on their way to the clinic with hours of treatments ahead for her, tattered waiting rooms, and mediocre coffee for him. "What do you mean, sell the house? What, are we just going to move down to the clinic full time?" She still had the strength to give him an annoyed look. It was one of the few pleasures she had left. "I mean after I'm dead." "Mom, don't talk like that." "If I don't talk like that now, when do I do it?" She pulled down the scarf where it had begun to creep above her ears. "When?" "No, you just listen. That's not your house. You don't want to live there after I'm gone. You'll never keep it clean anyway. I don't want to think about it right now." "You never want to think about things like that. That's why you're still doing what you're doing, Theo. That's why you're living with me." "I could have moved out if you hadn't gotten sick." She made a face. "Maybe. But you listen to me. You sell it. Get yourself a nice apartment. Then you'll have a little money. You can go back to school. Get a degree. You could have done well in school if you'd ever tried. The teachers always said you were bright, but you wanted to spend all your time in those rock and roll bands. The house is almost paid off. There's a second mortgage for the kitchen remodeling, of course, but you'll still get enough to go to school." The thought of how it would happen was ghastly, but it kindled something inside him all the same, something that might have been an idea of eventual freedom. "We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it later, Mom. You're going to beat this thing." "You are a very bad liar, Theo." She paused for a long beat. "It's a lucky thing you're musical." He flicked a glance at her. Yes, she was. She was smiling. It was all just weird beyond belief. Did my mother have to get cancer to develop a sense of humor? That's a fairly shitty trade-off, isn't it? But there are no trade-offs. The universe isn't a machine for fairness. There's no complaints department. There's no court of higher appeal. Pretty well sucks, doesn't it? The descent went on throughout the spring and early summer, a free fall both agonizingly swift and yet somehow as thrashingly, stickily slow as a nightmare. Johnny Battistini quit coming over, unable to face the scarecrow figure that Anna Vilmos had become, although he still called from time to time to ask after her and to urge Theo to get out just for an evening. "Come on," he said the last time. "It would do you a lot of good, man, just for a couple of hours." "Right, right. And what if she falls down in the bathroom while I'm out?" Theo heard the hysterical edge in his own voice, as though he were eavesdropping on someone else's conversation. "I'm supposed to just sit there drinking beers and scoping chicks and hope that doesn't happen? Easy for you to say. If it was your mom, you probably would." "Hey, man." Johnny's voice faltered. They were lurching across a line they had never crossed before. "Look, I can't do it, right? I'm sorry, man, but I can't. So just stop bugging me." "But what about the band, Thee? Guys are asking me when you're coming back." "Tell them as soon as my mother dies." Even in his fury, he realized he was getting too loud. He was only assuming Anna was still asleep in the other room. "Tell them once this whole inconvenience is over, I'll be back, cheerful and ready to play power chord music with a bunch of 20-year-olds. Yeah, with bells on. No need to worry about it." "Theo." "I don't care. Tell them I quit. Now leave me alone." Putting the phone down felt like slamming a door. He wanted to cry, but he wouldn't let himself. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Catherine's call a day later was a different kind of misery. Someone had told her about what was happening. Theo had resisted the urge to phone her up himself a dozen times, resisted it like a drunk fighting a late-night run to the liquor store. But now there she was, that familiar voice. But there was something different in it, a careful distance, as though she had scrubbed up like one of his mother's doctors before calling him, pulled on surgical gloves and a mask. I'm really, really sorry to hear about your mom, Theo. It's pretty tough. On her, I mean. Catherine asked how he was doing, listened while he talked a little about the icy horror of the daily routine, even made a little small talk of her own, a promotion at work, a movie she'd like. But there was an unmistakable subtext to the entire conversation. This call is about loyalty and human decency, but nothing more than that. Don't get ideas. No problem there. His ideas were gone. When the careful Pt.2 with Catherine was over, he walked into the living room feeling entirely empty, as though something had eaten him away from the inside out, removing all the essential Theo-ness, leaving only the skin. He found his mother sitting on the couch, her head back but her eyes open. The television was off. She was so far gone most afternoons, wandering far off the map in the realms of her own pain, that she didn't even bother to turn it on anymore. I think it's time for me to go to the hospital, she said when she heard him. You had your appointment this morning, remember? She shook her head, but just barely, as though if she turned it too far, it might simply fall off. She was having a very bad day, he could tell. No, I mean it's time for me to move into the hospital. Something had a grip on his innards, something chilly that squeezed. You don't need to do that, Mom. We're doing all right here, aren't we? She closed her eyes. You're doing fine, Theo. You're a good son. But the doctor thinks so too. I can't do it any longer. Do what? Hold up my side of the bargain. I'm too tired. I hurt too much. I want to rest. But you can't. You can do that here. She raised her fingers to quiet him. I don't want you carrying me around, Theo. You've had to do that a few times already, and I don't want to have my own son wiping my bottom. I couldn't stand that. It's time. But it's time. And so the last pitched phase of the descent began, a voyage into the depths as bad in its way as anything Dante had imagined. But there would be no beatific vision at the end, Theo felt blankly certain. No shining city, only the endless white corridors of the hospital ward. She was letting go. He could feel it, spinning away from him like a moon that had broken the tethers of its orbit and would soon disappear into the empty, dark spaces. He spent part of every day at her side, trying to concentrate on books he had been planning to read for months or even years. There was no point in being with her all the time, but what else was there to do? He was afraid to return to his job, as if somehow that would be tempting fate, would ensure the receipt of the dreaded phone call while he was away from her, more surely than if he were simply sitting around the house. The boys in the band had taken him at his own grief-maddened word and had made the split official. John had left him a halting, apologetic message, making it clear without ever quite saying it, and Theo had not bothered to call him back. A sympathy call from a friend of his and Kat's, really more acquaintance than friend, had also gifted him with the unwanted information that Catherine was dating someone. When he hung up, he put on an old Smith's record and walked through the house from room to room, trying to remember what a person was supposed to feel like inside. It sometimes seemed to Theo that he was letting go too, cutting all ties, following his mother on his own journey into the void. Only the knowledge that she had no one else kept him connected to the earth. Uncle Harold had come to visit once in the early days, but he was even less gifted with sickbed chat than Johnny Battistini, and Theo knew they would not see him again. There were still a few good days, though, days when the pain was not too bad, her mind not too fogged by painkillers. He wished he had more news of his own to offer her as distraction, but he was as barren as a stone. It didn't seem to matter, though. When she felt well enough to focus, she talked. It was as though during its destructive course, the cancer had also eaten away a wall inside her, the partition that had kept in all the normal chit-chat and reminiscence, so that he had only realized when she became sick what a stranger she was to him. She talked about Theo himself at first, about his childhood, his school days, his inordinate love of Halloween, and the work of trying to make the costumes he wanted. But then, increasingly, she began to talk about her girlhood in Chicago. She told him stories he had never heard about the large Irish family of which she was the youngest child, of all those aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, and sisters from whom she had become estranged when her mother did the unforgivable, in a Catholic family anyway, and divorced Anna's abusive, drunkard father. Theo knew little of this history, but it explained why he had met almost none of his relatives on his mother's side of the family. And it also explained why Theo's grandma Dowd, a woman with 7 children in Illinois, should have wound up living with her youngest out in California. Hearing his mother talk now, he missed his maternal grandmother all over again. Grandma Dowd had been much more loving than her daughter, so much so that Theo had sometimes felt that he and his grandmother had a sort of secret treaty. Most of the childhood things he remembered fondly had her in them somewhere. Trips to the drugstore that stretched to the candy counter as well, little gifts of money when his parents weren't looking, and of course all her wonderful, quirky old country stories about fairies and giants that made his mother roll her eyes and actively irritated his aerospace technician father, who thought his mother-in-law was filling the boy with what he called simple-minded nonsense. Grandma Dowd had died when Theo was 12. At the time, he had thought it didn't bother him much, had been surprised and impressed at his own sang-froid. He realized he had simply been too young to know how much it truly hurt. And now, as though in dying, her daughter was somehow assuming her essence, he almost felt he was at his grandmother's bedside, something he had been denied the first time as she lay dying from pneumonia, since his parents had thought it would give him nightmares. This is my whole family, he thought, staring down at his mother's wasted, sleeping form. My whole family is dying. I'm the last one left. And before I finish up this section, well, no, I'll just finish this section. And then I'll tell you, by the way, this is Tad speaking, not the book. Or not the Tad that wrote the book. Well, it is, never mind. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you that. I realize these early chapters are very bleak and very depressing. It's not like that through the whole book. Honest, it's not. Honest, it's not. So for those of you who don't know the book, please don't think it's going to be death and illness and misery through the whole thing. I saved that for my actual family and having to live with me. I want to tell you something, his mother said. Theo sat up in the chair, startled out of a half sleep and another of those persistent, disturbingly vivid dreams in which he was looking out through fogged glass, as though he were a shut-in or a captive animal in a terrarium. He had definitely felt himself to be someone else this time, not Theo at all, but instead something old and cold and amused. It had been terrifying, and his heart was still hammering. At first, before he saw his mother's open eyes, he thought that the whisper might have been part of his dream. She slept so much now, sometimes through the whole of his mornings or afternoon visits. He had almost begun to think of her as something motionless, as an effigy, although there were also the times she moaned in pain, even after the nurse had come to give her more medication, and he found himself wishing frantically for the return of that absent, dismal quietude. And there were still moments of lucidity, as this seemed to be. What is it, Mom? Do you need more meds? No. It was a sound made only by the least amount of air, a sip. Deep breath pained her, made smaller the space in which the cancer grew, like a dark conqueror. I want to tell you something. He pulled his chair over close to the bed, took her dry, cold hand in his. I'm listening. I'm sorry. For what? That I didn't love you like I should have, Theo. Through the haze, she was trying to see him properly. Her eyes rolled a little, trying to focus. It wasn't your fault. I don't know what you mean, Mom. He inched closer so he could hear her better. You did fine. No, I didn't do what I should have. It was just something happened when you were a little baby, practically a newborn. I suppose it was that. What do they call it? She paused to get her breath, laboring in a way that made his stomach lurch. Postnatal depression? I don't know. We didn't know about those things, really. But it just happened one day. I went to your bassinet. You were crying and you wouldn't stop. Gas, maybe. She showed the ghost of a smile. But I suddenly just felt like I didn't care, that you weren't really my baby. She frowned and closed her eyes, trying to summon the right words. No, it must have been different than that. I didn't even understand what a baby was anymore. Just a little screaming thing, not a part of me. She screwed her eyes more tightly shut against a wave of pain. Not a part of me. You can't beat yourself up about things like that, Mom. I should have got help. I tried to tell your father. He didn't understand. Told me I just needed more rest. But I didn't love you the way I should have. I never did. I'm so sorry, Theo. He felt his eyes sting. You did all right. You did your best. That's a terrible thing, isn't it? Now her eyes came open, fully open, and for the first time in days he thought she really saw him, complete and true with a terrible clarity that would make normal, everyday life a nightmare. He tried hard to hold that awful stare. What is, Mom? What's a terrible thing? When you die, and the only thing anyone can say about you is, she did her best. She took a shaky breath and waited so long to take another one that his heart began to race. When she finally spoke, it was in a whispery quaver like a frightened child. Could you sing me a song, Theo? A song? I haven't heard you sing in so long. You always had such a nice voice. What would you like to hear, Mom? But she only closed her eyes and gave a little wave of her hand. He recalled the first day he had found out about her illness, when they had gone out to hear the band play. An old one then, an old Irish tune. She liked those. I wish I was in Carrickfergus, he began quietly, only for nights in Ballygran. I would swim over the deepest ocean, my love to find. She smiled a bit, so he kept going. A nurse stuck her head in the room, curious about the sound, but then backed out again, staying near the doorway to listen, but trying not to intrude. Theo ignored her, struggling to remember the words, the tale of some nameless poet's regret. But the sea is wide, and I can't swim over, and neither have I the wings to fly. If I could find me a handsome boatman to ferry me over, my love and I. The words were coming back to him, which was a relief, since he didn't want to break the spell. This felt more like being called upon to perform a ritual than just singing an old song. He sang it as simply as he could, avoiding the reflexive mannerisms of pop music. Only as he finished the last verse and began the final chorus did he remember what it was really about, the poet's regrets in the face of imminent death. He faltered for a moment, but saw that his mother was asleep, the smile still on her lips, faint as starlight on a still lake. For I'm drunk today, and I'm rarely sober, a handsome rover from town to town. But I am sick now, and my days are numbered. So come all ye young men, and lay me down. He left her there sleeping. The nurse, a young Asian woman, smiled and started to say something to him as he came out of the room, but saw the look on his face and decided not to speak. In the end, Anna Vilmos did not get even half a year. She died in the middle of the night, August 8th. It seemed to be a good death, given the circumstances. A nurse saw that she didn't appear to be breathing, took her pulse, then began the list of procedures that would ultimately free up the bed for another patient. Someone from the hospital called Theo at home, and after giving him the news, told him there was no point in coming in before the morning. But he roused himself anyway and got into his mother's old car, feeling that it would be safer to drive in his somnambulant condition than to ride his motorcycle. They had drawn the curtain around the bed, covered her face with a sheet. He pulled it back, his thoughts fractured into such tiny whirling pieces he felt like a snow globe, felt he had been shaken and then set down. She did not look peaceful, particularly. She didn't look like anything. She looks like where someone used to be, but isn't anymore. He kissed her cold cheek, then went to find the night administrator to make arrangements. And that's where we're going to stop for tonight. Now that we have finished the really depressing part of the book, I do apologize. I had forgotten. I remembered that the miscarriage section was painful and unpleasant, but I forgot the whole section with Theo's mom, and that's not really fun listening either. So I apologize for not having mentioned that ahead of time. However, that said, we are now moving into the things start to happen stage, which is going to have a lot of entertaining, interesting, and angry and violent and crazy stuff happening. So anyway, I apologize again for forgetting to mention before I started this book that in the first 3 chapters or so are quite grim. But I've gone over that enough now. I think I've made the point. Anyway, I do thank you for bearing with me. Those of you who have not been scared away by the story so far will learn a great deal of what is going to happen to Theo in this new life of his. And you're also going to get more than a glimpse of fairyland. But this is not your father's fairyland. This is not your grandpa or grandma's fairyland. This is the newfangled fairyland, the modern, happening, up-to-date fairyland. So you have that to look forward to. Anyway, with that, thank you again for joining me, and continue to be good to yourselves, be good to those around you, your loved ones, your family, assuming they're loved ones too, your neighbors and friends, and pretty much everybody that you can. So while you're doing all those things, just continue on trying to make the world a better place. Because really, honestly, it's like an election, it's only when enough people are trying to do the right thing that the right thing starts to happening more often. You have to build a critical mass of people doing right and being good and being kind to each other. So with that thought, I'm going to leave you, and thank you all for hanging with me through this whole pandemic so far, and let you know that I will see you very soon next week, and we will do the same thing. We'll be reading at 2 a.m. in the morning Pacific Standard Time, and then again at 7 p.m. in the evening Pacific Standard Time. So thanks, bye, see you soon.